Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how to create your own AI assistant using OpenAI's new assistant functionality. It allows you to create your own assistant based on the inputs you dictate. So I've created an example where my assistant will solely ask questions about compliant development for properties based on the guideline provided by the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. So this is the document that has been provided. It's over 141 pages long. And for example, if you're a developer and don't have time to read through all of it, you can easily ask this assistant a set of questions. So for example, my question is, what is exempt development? And then the AI will now take the input, i.e. the file, and then compile an answer for me based on my question. So here it says exempt development refers to minimal and low impact development, etc., etc. So let's get started on creating your own AI assistant based on a set of data files that you want to feed in. So the first thing we're going to do is create our own assistant. We can do this by going to platforms.openai.com/assistants and then press create and then just enter a name. Let's call it New South Wales Development Assistant. And you have to give a set of instructions on what what you want the assistant to help you with. So I already created this prompt from a previous test. So here I'm telling that your assistant that helps homeowners, developers understand the legislative requirements, etc., etc. At the end, I tell it you can only answer questions related to development. Do not answer any other questions not related. Now, the model we need in order to take an input of a file is the Turbo 1106. And then here, you got to click retrieval. This means that you can upload a file to OpenAI. And then once you press upload, select the file that you want to upload. Here, now I'm uploading the guide to compliant development.pdf, which I've downloaded from the New South Wales Department of Planning. Now press save. Now your assistant is now created. So let's jump back to FlutterFlow in implementing this assistant into FlutterFlow. So now that we're back in FlutterFlow, we need to configure a set of APIs that allows us to access this assistant. So what I highly recommend is reading through and referring to the API reference. The APIs we need are related to the threads, the messages, and runs. So think of a thread as opening a chat with the assistant. So every single time a user open a thread, it's a new chat with the assistant, and messages are basically the messages that you as a user send to the assistant, and runs is every time that a message is sent, you want to run the assistant in order to retrieve the information for the assistant to reply. So let's just quickly look at the API for creating a thread. So what we want is whenever this chat system pops up, a chat page pops up, we want to create a new thread. In order to do this, you can just refer to documentation down here. You just copy this URL and let's go to API calls. What we want to do is add a group of API calls. So let's just call it Open API. The base URL is this section. All APIs through OpenAPI will go through this base link, and then we need to create 3 headers that you can easily see here. So firstly, just copy the content type. It's JSON. The second one is the authorization key. And then lastly, you want to copy the OpenAI Assistant v1. I would also add a group variable for called assistant ID. Because we're only having one assistant in this chat, it allows us to refer to that assistant regularly throughout the API, across all our other API calls. So the assistant ID will be this one here that we just recently created, default value of that. And then for the authorization key, you can grab it from your settings here. And here I have already copied. So I'm going to copy mine here, and here you can just press add group. So the next step we're going to do is add the individual API calls we need. So the first thing we're going to do is add API call. This is going to be a post request, and based on the documentation, we need threads as an endpoint. And then let's call it threads. And then in terms of any data we need to feed it, none whatsoever, because these three key headers are already contained in the group headers. So what we can do quickly here is test it by feeding in the assistant variable. So the default is already there, but let's just include it here. We can test the API call. So it looks to be working. So what we need to obtain from here is this thread ID. So click the thread ID, because ultimately we need to save the chat somewhere, save the chat ID somewhere, so we can use it later to retrieve information elsewhere. So press add call. Oh, whoops. Let's call it thread ID. Add call. Dismiss this call. Cool. Now, the next thing we're going to do is messages. So what we need to do here is create a message. These are basically messages that we are sending to our assistant. So here we just copy the same API endpoint as specified in the documentation. We press add API call, post request, and here let's just quickly fix this as a variable. Let's call it messages. So we need to add firstly thread ID as a variable we can refer to. Let's call it string. False. Cool. What we also need to feed OpenAI is, based on documentation, is these two bodies. So there's a role of user and a content. So this is basically the message we're sending. So the content will be a variable. So let's create a variable for that. And then in the body of this call, we will put JSON, and the body is going to be like this. And then we'll press add call. Cool, we can test this quickly. Let me quickly retrieve the old thread ID that we previously tested or previously generated. Let me just save this somewhere. So thread ID is here, and content is, let's call it what is, so this is the message, what is exam development. Let's test it to see if this works. Cool. It seems to be sending the message. That's good. Let's quickly save the value of our message so we can add it, so we can refer to it. Press save. Great. Now the next thing we're going to do is add the run. So the run is basically every single time the message is sent, after we've sent it, we need to run the assistant. Think of it as running the assistant on the thread to interpret the latest message in order to provide a response. So we're going to create a run here. So let's go copy this endpoint and create an add API call, post request. And it's going to be similar to this. So let's call it create run. The variable we need, as always, is the thread ID. And then based on the documentation, we need the assistant ID. So here we're going to copy this And on the body, press JSON. And then the assistant ID, because it's already a group variable, we don't need to create a variable for this specific API call. So the assistant ID, we can just drag it in, press add call. And let's quickly test this out to see if it works. The thread ID I've already saved somewhere from our previous test. So let's quickly test this. It seems to be working perfectly fine. We can see here that the run is showing that we have a file that we are referring to. This is the file that we uploaded when we created the assistant originally. So let's quickly also save the run ID because we'll want to use it a bit later. Click run ID. Let's call it run ID here. Cool. So what we need to do next is, now that we have ran the assistant, the system will now provide a response. And in order to retrieve the message of the latest response, we need to use the list message get request. So we can just copy this endpoint here. Let's add another API call, get /thread/messages. We're going to format thread ID here, variable thread ID, which is a string. Based on the documentation, we can also limit it. So we can limit it, we can order it, and so on and so on. What I want to do is maybe limit to 1. So in the query parameter, I put limit, specific value, integer of 1. So this means the latest, or only one output, which is basically the latest because the default order by is descending order. Let's quickly add a name called list message. And let's quickly test to see if this works. So copy, paste the thread ID. Let's test this. Looks to be good. So remember how previously we asked what is the exempt development in that message and we ran it. Here, the assistant is saying exempt development refers to certain minor residential development, etc., etc. So it seems to be working. So what we need to do now is capture this response of the system. Here we can just click select it here, and let's call this assistance response. Maybe list message assistant. Let's add call. As a final step, when I was testing it out, was you got to know when the run has finished. Because it's an assistant, it's reading the documentation, you only want to retrieve the messages after the run has finished. You don't want to retrieve it too early, or else it will be showing your message, like the user's message. So what you need to do here is retrieve run, so we can see the status of completed based on the run ID. So here we can copy the endpoint and then add API call. Let's call it this. Let's quickly format it to FlutterFlow's requirements. So the variables we need are thread ID and run ID. Both are type string. So here I already copied previously the run ID, and let's quickly test this based on the information I copied out. Great. Here you can see here the status is completed, which means the system has finished running my initial query and have responded to it. Now let's quickly select the status. Let's just call it run status, add call. Perfect. These are the 5 kind of API calls we need to create. So what we need to do next is build out the chat view of our assistant. So I'm going to start from a blank slate. The first thing we're going to do is have a container, of course. And then what I'm envisioning is that there's going to be a header explaining like what the assistant is about, or a title of some sort, and then a message, a chat box message, showing the list of messages from us and the assistant's response. In addition, lastly, a kind of input text field where you can ask questions. Very basic message chat app. So let's quickly do that. So first what we're going to do is add a container. And this container is going to be, let's call this a title container. Let's also add a column here. This column will be called the chat column. And lastly, what I want to do is add a message container. So let's call this message container. And I'm going to remove these heights as well. Great, let's add a title first. So let's quickly format the background color to this. Let's put infinite width so it stretches across. And let's add a text box inside. Let's call this a New South Wales Compliant Development AI Assistant. Let's quickly change the text to white. Size font of 16. Great, 16. And then let's add some padding to it so it looks a bit neater. Or maybe let's say size 22 so it looks a bit bigger. Let's change max line to 1 so it looks a bit even. So next step is building the chat view. So let's add a container. Let me quickly change this. So the primary background color, let's make it pure white. Yes, whatever. And then secondly, I don't really like dark mode, so I want to turn it off. Cool. So next step is we added a container. Let me just shrink this. And then let's add a list view. So this is basically going to contain our chat between the assistant and ourselves. I'm going to have an assistant container. And then we will also have a user container. Within the assistant container, let's add a text for the assistant. And then for the user, let's also add a text. The formatting of it, I try to remove the height and width so the container can wrap according to what according to the text. To make it a bit neater, let's just quickly format the coloring of it. So the assistant, let's make it the same dark blue with a white font. Let's call it, let's bring this here, maybe call it title medium. Okay, maybe that's a bit too much. Let's bring it to 16. Color white. Now for this one, let's make our container, the user container, more blue, more gray. So here it looks like this. So what we need to do here is also add some. So what we're going to also do is add some padding, so it's not against the wall. And I'm going to move this to the right side for user and left side for assistant. So it looks like a typical kind of chat. And what I also like to do here is add some padding for the text. So let's add maybe 10. Let's round the edges of the containers. So let's bring the border radius to 10 for both the assistant and the user. This looks okay. One final thing we're going to do is wrap actually these two in a column. Yikes. Wrap this two in a column. So let me fix this. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do next is have a chat history. The reason why we need a chat history is because every single time the assistant runs and we are retrieving the latest message, we need to save that somewhere, or else it will only, or else there'll be no historical log of the chat that you can refer back to. So in the page state here, we can add chat history. and it's going to be a list of string. And what we can now do is use in the list view, we can generate dynamic children based on this page state. So what we need to do next is remember how there was a lot of responses about thread ID, run ID. We actually need to save that somewhere so we can refer to it when we make our subsequent API calls. So what we need here is to add some other variable. So a thread ID of string. We need to add the run ID of type string. And then we also need to add the status of type, where is the type string? I think that's about it in terms of setting it up. We'll find out if there's any problem later on and we can fix it further. Now let's add the bottom checkbox, which allows the user to enter a message. So we have a message container here. Let's add a row. The first part of the row will be the input field, the text inbox. So input, maybe text field here. Great. And let's add an icon to send the text to his icon. Great. Let's quickly format this to make it a bit nicer. Let's make this background. Let's make this color black, sure. I'm going to disable the label property. And in the hint property, I'm going to write, ask me anything related to complying development from the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. Cool. Let's remove the border, remove this underline looking thing. Let's make it field. The field color should be, let's make it alternate. Delete this label text. Let's add some padding. So let's add 20. Actually, let's change the background of this to alternate as well. Let's make this text padded to maybe 10 everywhere. And then we'll make this icon button left padding of 10. Let's change this to send. Maybe just pick, I don't know, pick one of these and then change. Let's remove the fill color, remove the border. This looks okay. So here, this allows the user to enter some text. So what I like to do here is also from an alignment perspective, align this to the bottom for the chat column, expand it as much as possible so this fills up majority of the text. I think that's it from a design perspective. Oh yeah, what we're going to do here for the container, we need to show the assistance message separate from the user message. If we leave it like this, oh, it's a bit of a font difference here. I'll quickly fix this. Size 16. Let's change this to size 16 as well. What we need to do here is set the assistance response to be different visibility to the user. If you don't set this, it will show our message twice initially. So for example, you ask them a question, it will show that question twice. And then when the assistant responds, it will show the assistant's response twice. So in order to do that, you need to, firstly, let's set the message itself. Instead of hello world, history item, confirm. Here, history item, confirm. So we need to set a conditional visibility. So here, the conditional visibility, we need to know whether the index of this item, the first one, is odd or even. So for example here, let's call it chat position. We need to firstly get the history items index. So for the assistant, it will always be an odd number because we will always chat first. So that's 0. And then when they respond, it'll be a 1. So we need to know whether, this chat position, a modular 2, it's like division basically. What is the remainder? is not equal to 0. So let's check for error. Confirm. Easy. So let's copy this same expression into the users container. Let's go to code expression, paste, and then want to equal 0, i.e. there's no remainder when it's being divided by 2. So I think that's it in terms of from a design perspective. So the first thing we've got to do now is when this page opens, we need to create a thread. This is almost like, hey, we're going to start a new conversation with you, AI assistant. So what we can do here is open the editor. So the first action we're going to make is an API call. So the API call is going to be threads because we're creating a new thread. So you refer to here. Remember, if you recall, this is basically the initial creation of threads. And what we need to do here is, let's see, we need to set any variables. I don't believe we need to set assistant ID because that's already in the group as a default. So let's quickly call this API result, thread result. And then let's update the page state with the response of the thread ID. So you press set value, and it's going to be action output, thread result, JSON body, JSON path, thread ID. Perfect. Cool. Quickly test to see if it works is instead of New South Wales compliant assistant, maybe just add, just call it thread ID here and test to see if it works. Great, see, as soon as it loaded up, it created a thread ID. Now let's go back to here. Let's quickly change this name back to whatever it was. I think it was called, yeah, there it is, New South Wales Compliant Development Assistant. Now, the next thing we're going to do is the user sends a message. They input a message here and then press the send button. What I like to do here also before I go further is do a show loading indicator. This allows this to spin. So because the API takes some time, so we want to spin to inform the user indirectly that, you know, your message has been sent. However, the AI is getting back to you with a response. So we're going to create an action. The first action we're going to do is the API call of creating a message. So we got to feed in the thread ID, which is saved in our page state. And then we don't need the system ID. We need to feed in the content, which is basically the message. It's going to be widget state and text field. And let's quickly change this to, let's call it message output. Now, what we need to do here is add the message to our chat history because this is just making the call. We need to save what the user has sent. So let's go to state. Let's update the app state of chat history. Add, where is it? Add to list the widget states text field. Next, let's quickly clear what the text field is. So it's blank. Now that we have sent a message to assistant, we need to run the system so it can get back to us with response. So what we're going to do now here is do the API call, the run API call. So create run. Here, we need to pass in the thread ID. Let's use the page states thread ID here. And then let's quickly refer to this as run output. Now next, when we use a run output, so if you look at the documentation, when we create a run, it actually comes back as a response with a run ID. So we have to save that run ID somewhere so we can check the status of that run. So let's go back to here, add state, update state. Here we've got to save the run ID. Set value as action output, run output, JSON body, JSON path, run ID. because we don't want to retrieve the response until the run has finished, like until the system has finished thinking and processing and getting us back with a response. And remember how I spoke about how the retrieve run status has to be completed, and then the system will have finished running with a response back to us. So here we need to create a loop where the condition of the status is not equal to completed. Well, what happens here is that the run will occur here, and then an ID, the run ID will be saved. And then in this loop, we will keep checking whether the status is completed. If it's not completed, it means that the AI assistant is still processing and yet to get back to us with a response. Once it is completed, a response will be saved in the list messages. So going back here, we need to make an API call. We need to check the status of it, which is the retrieve run. And what we need to set is the thread ID, which we have in the page state. And then also the run ID, which you also have in the page state. And let's call this retrieve run output. When this is true, we want to break the loop. So break this loop so it's not endless. So this API call will keep running. And then every single time this API call runs, we want to save the output, save the status to the page state. When the status is completed, it'll break this loop, and this loop will end. And then the next set of API call where we are retrieving the message will now contain the assistant's response. So let's quickly set this page state. The page state status set value equal to action output, retrieve run output, JSON body, JSON path, run status. Now this loop has been broken. It means the assistant has finished thinking about it. Let's add the API call where we want to retrieve the message of the assistant. So go to list message, set the variable. What we need is a thread ID as always, the page state, thread ID, the action output. Let's call it latest assistance response output. So once the assistant has responded, we need to save the assistant's response into our chat history. So let's update the state of the chat history here. And what we need to do is add to list. So what we need to add is the response of the assistants. So JSON body, JSON path, here, this one, and confirm. And lastly, once that's done, we need to reset the state, the page state, because it's in a completed state as of this point in time. If we run it again, if we send another message, it will go straight to the completed state, which is not right because the assistant hasn't finished thinking. So when this whole process is finished, we need to update the page state status to, just reset value. So it's blank again. Cool. Let's see if this works. So let's quickly do a quick test here. Instant reload. Let's ask a question. What is an exempt development? Let's send it and see if it works. So our message is here. Our spinning wheel, our loading wheel is here. So it informs the user that the system is thinking about it. And now we can see a response. An exempt development is a minor building project that does not require planning and construction approval. On the other hand, blah, 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 blah. And this is retrieved directly from the document we have trained the assistant on, or we have fed it. Let's ask another question. Explain to me more about State Environmental Planning Policy, SEPP. Cool. You can see here the response is SEPP, for example, blah, 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 is the relevant legislation, etc., etc. It's basically explaining to us what it is. So the AI assistant looks to be working perfectly. So this is how you create your own personal AI assistant. Using documents you can feed to train the model. Currently, you can upload up to 20 documents to train your assistant, which is quite extensive. And this can be done across a range of document types. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content on FlutterFlow and building your own app with minimal coding experience.